In the spring of the year 61 CE, on a flat stretch of ground somewhere along the Roman road that later generations would call Watling Street, tens of thousands of Britons parked their wagons in a wide arc at the edge of a plain, and they brought their families because they had come to watch an army die. The Roman historian Cassius Dio claimed the host that gathered there numbered 230,000 people, a figure almost certainly inflated, but even the cautious modern estimates leave the Britons outnumbering the Romans by something close to 10 to 1. Their queen, Boudica, had already burned 3 Roman cities to the ground. Colchester was ash, London was ash, St. Albans was ash. Tacitus records that 70,000 Romans and Roman allies were already dead. The people ringing that plain were not nervous. They were spectators. Facing them, backed into a narrow defile with dense forest behind him and open ground in front, stood the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus with, in Tacitus's words, nearly 10,000 armed men, built around a single formation at the center of his line, the 14th Legion, roughly 5,000 soldiers. And before a single javelin flew, those 5,000 men did something that should have been impossible. In a matter of minutes, without maps, without radios, without name tags, without a single officer physically dragging men into place, 5,000 individual human beings sorted themselves into exactly the right cohort, exactly the right century, exactly the right file, and exactly the right rank, shield edge to shield edge, in a formation so precise that by nightfall, according to Tacitus, roughly 80,000 Britons lay dead on that plain against about 400 Romans. How? How does a crowd of 5,000 men become a machine in minutes? The answer was carried on their equipment. It was painted on their shields. It was built into 5-foot poles hung with silver discs. And part of it was literally written in letters, on the one place on a legionary's kit that almost no documentary ever mentions. Not the front of the shield. We will get there. Here is exactly what this episode covers. First, what the paint on a legionary shield actually said. Based on real painted shields archaeologists pulled out of the desert at Dura-Europos in Syria, the closest thing we have to a photograph of a legion's colors. Second, the writing that the Roman military writer Vegetius says appeared on the shields themselves, naming the individual soldier and his unit, which turned every shield into something like a postal address. Third, how a decorated pole called a signum could tell a man his exact position in a line of thousands within seconds, and why some historians think its silver discs may have functioned as a unit number you could read at 100 paces. Fourth, the 3 different Roman horns, the tuba, the cornu, and the bucina, and why each instrument was only permitted to say certain things, creating a grammar of sound that cut through the noise of 40,000 screaming enemies. And fifth, the one failure point of the entire system, the single thing that, when it broke, erased 3 entire legions from the Roman army list in the year 9 CE, and explains why Rome would spend decades and fight wars to recover a handful of metal birds. One note before we begin. Everything here rests on the surviving sources: Tacitus, Polybius, Josephus, Caesar's own field reports, Vegetius's 4th century training manual, and physical evidence like the painted shields of Dura-Europos and the illustrated army lists of the Notitia Dignitatum. Where those sources disagree, or where historians are still arguing, I will say so plainly. So go back to that plain on Watling Street and slow the moment down. First, understand how Paulinus got there, because the revolt itself explains the desperation of his position. Boudica's husband, Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, had died, leaving his kingdom jointly to his 2 daughters and the emperor Nero, a legal maneuver meant to buy his family protection. Rome's local officials, led by the procurator Cassius Decianus, treated the will as an invitation to loot. Tacitus records that Boudica was flogged and her daughters raped, and the Iceni, joined by the neighboring Trinovantes, rose with a fury that caught the province completely exposed, because Paulinus and the bulk of his army were 200 miles away on the island of Mona, modern Anglesey, burning the sacred groves of the Druids. When the 9th Legion under Quintus Petilius Cerealis marched to relieve Colchester, the Britons ambushed it on the road and destroyed its infantry outright. Cerealis escaped with only his cavalry. So by the time Paulinus forced marched back down Watling Street, 1 legion was gutted, another, the 2nd, refused to move from its base, and the procurator who had lit the fire had already fled to Gaul. Paulinus then spent the days before the battle doing something that looked, to the Britons, like running away. He abandoned London rather than defend it, a decision Tacitus describes as coldly deliberate, sacrificing a city to save a province. And Tacitus adds the detail that those too old, too young, or too attached to the place to leave with the army were killed where they stayed. He marched his forces up the Roman road until the ground itself gave him what his numbers could not: a defile, a natural corridor with wooded slopes protecting both flanks and forests sealing the rear, opening onto a plain with no cover. Whatever came at him could only come from the front, and it could not wrap around him. Tacitus is explicit that Paulinus chose this position for exactly these reasons. Now consider what had to happen inside that defile. 10,000 men, the 14th Legion at the core, detachments of the 20th, and auxiliary infantry and cavalry on the wings, arrived as a marching column, which is to say as a snake, 4 to 6 men wide and miles long. A column cannot fight. A column that gets caught as a column gets massacred. And we will see later in this episode precisely what that massacre looks like. So the entire battle, for Rome, came down to one transformation: turning the snake into a wall before the enemy closed the distance. For the legion in the center, that meant roughly 5,000 men finding their places. Not places, their places. A legionary of the 1st century of the 3rd cohort did not stand with the 2nd century of the 3rd cohort. His century of 80 men formed in a specific block, in a specific position relative to the other 5 centuries of his cohort, and his cohort held a specific slot in the legion's line, and inside his century he had a specific file and rank, standing beside the same 7 men he shared a tent with, a squad the Romans called a contubernium. Get that wrong at scale, mix even a few hundred men into the wrong blocks, and the gaps and doubled files ripple down the line, the relief system breaks, and the wall springs leaks. Tacitus tells us the legion formed in close order in the defile, took the British charge at a standstill, threw 2 volleys of javelins, and then advanced in wedge formations that split the enormous, formless British mass into fragments. Pause on those javelins, because the pilum was itself a piece of engineering aimed at exactly this moment. Behind its pyramidal iron point ran a long, thin iron shank, designed so that when the weapon punched through a shield, the shank bent or the point lodged, and the shield it hit became an anchor dragging at its owner's arm. 10,000 of those in 2 waves, thrown into a packed crowd at perhaps 20 meters, meant that the Britons who reached the Roman line arrived shieldless, winded and compressed by the mass behind them, at precisely the moment the legionaries drew the short gladius, a blade built not for swinging room, but for stabbing out of a wall. The Britons, hemmed in at the rear by their own ring of wagons, by their own audience, were butchered against it. 80,000 dead, by Tacitus's count, in an afternoon, and Tacitus adds that the Romans did not spare the baggage animals. One province saved by one afternoon of geometry. But the geometry is the part everyone skips. Every documentary shows you the wall of shields. Almost none of them ask how each individual shield knew where in the wall it belonged. And that question matters far beyond one battle in Britain, because the answer is a system. One of the most underrated pieces of military technology in the ancient world, and it was made of paint, wood, silver, and sound. Start with the concept, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A Roman legion solved the problem of 5,000 men the same way a modern city solves the problem of 5 million letters, with a nested address. Legion, cohort, century, contubernium, file. 10 cohorts to a legion. 6 centuries of 80 men to a standard cohort, with the first cohort, in the imperial period, enlarged and given the legion's senior centurions, including the primus pilus, the first spear, the most prestigious rank an ordinary soldier could ever reach. 10 8-man tent groups to a century, and each century carried its own miniature chain of command, stitched into the formation itself. The centurion at the front right corner, the optio stationed at the rear to shove stragglers back into their files, the tesserarius who managed the watchwords. Every soldier carried that address on his body and his equipment, and the battlefield itself was signposted with markers that corresponded to it. The soldier did not need to understand the whole formation, and this is the elegant part. He needed to answer only 3 small questions. Where is my century's standard? Where is my place relative to that standard? And who stands on my left and right? If every man could answer those 3 questions, the formation assembled itself, from the bottom up, like a crystal forming, with no officer directing traffic from above. The commander placed perhaps 60 standards. The standards placed 5,000 men. The first layer of the address was the shield. Vegetius, writing in the late 4th century but drawing on older manuals, including works going back to Cato the Elder and Frontinus, states that each cohort had its own distinct emblems, he calls them digmata, painted on the shields, precisely so that soldiers could not scatter from their comrades in the confusion of battle. Read that reasoning again, because it is not decoration. It is navigation. In a melee, a legionary who glanced sideways could tell within a heartbeat whether the shields around him carried his cohort's pattern or a stranger's, the way you can tell in an instant that you have wandered into the wrong sports crowd by the colors around you. And this is not just Vegetius' claim. At Dura-Europos, a Roman garrison town on the Euphrates in Syria, destroyed around 256 CE, excavators from Yale University and the French Academy, digging between 1928 and 1937, found actual painted Roman shields preserved by the desert, buried in the very rampart the defenders had packed with earth against Sasanian siege mines. Among them was a complete semi-cylindrical scutum, the only one ever found, roughly a meter tall, built from 3 cross-laminated layers of wooden strips, plywood in all but name, faced with hide, painted red, and covered edge to edge in designs, winged victory figures, an eagle, a lion. That single object collapses a century of guesswork about what a legionary actually carried, and the Notitia Dignitatum, a late Roman administrative document, preserves page after page of illustrated shield patterns, a different blazon for each unit, essentially a paint catalog of the entire late Roman army. Historians debate how far back the full one pattern per unit system goes, and how standardized it truly was in Boudicca's day. But the principle, that a shield's face announced its owner's unit, is about as well attested as anything in Roman military life. The second layer is the one I flagged at the start, the writing. Vegetius records that each soldier's name was written in letters on his shield, along with the cohort and century he belonged to. Sit with that. The largest professional army of the ancient world put name tags and unit codes on its riot shields. A shield picked up off the ground could be returned to its century. A man separated in fog or panic carried his own address with him. A body could be identified. Some historians question the details of Vegetius' account, whether the writing sat on the face or inside the boss or on the rim, and surviving examples are scarce, but ownership inscriptions scratched or punched onto Roman military gear, helmets especially, turn up regularly in the archaeology, often naming the soldier and his century, and sometimes naming 2 or 3 successive soldiers, because a helmet outlived its first owner and was reissued, each new man adding his own line, so that a single piece of bronze becomes a service record you can hold in your hand. Notice the second-order implication too. An army that writes names and unit codes on equipment is an army that assumes ordinary soldiers can read them, at least well enough to match letters, which tells you something about how deep functional literacy ran in the ranks. The habit was real. The legion was, among other things, a filing system, and every man was a labeled file. The third layer stood above the crowd, the signum, the century's standard. A pole, roughly the height of a man plus an arm, topped in many depictions with an open hand or a spearhead, hung with a crossbar, tassels, and a vertical stack of polished metal discs called phalerae. On Trajan's column in Rome, carved around 113 CE, you can count these standards by the dozen, and no 2 stacks of ornaments are quite alike. Some historians have argued that the number and arrangement of the discs encoded the century's identity, that a man could literally count the silverware and read a unit number at 100 paces. The evidence for that specific claim is thin, and it remains a hypothesis rather than a fact, so treat it as one. But what is not in doubt is the function. Each century had its own signum, carried by its signifer, a picked man who wore an animal pelt, bear or wolf, over his helmet so that he himself was recognizable at distance, and who held one of the most dangerous jobs in the army, because he carried a conspicuous pole instead of a usable shield, and stood exactly where the enemy wanted to strike. The standard was the century's fixed point in space. Where the signum planted, the century formed. When the signum advanced, the century advanced. When it turned, they turned. The Roman word for obeying orders in battle, following the standards, signa sequi, was not a metaphor. It was the literal instruction. Caesar gives us the perfect illustration from his first landing in Britain in 55 BCE, when his soldiers, facing deep water and a hostile beach, froze on the ships, and the Aquilifer of the 10th Legion jumped into the sea alone, eagle in hand, shouting that the men could betray their standard to the enemy if they liked, but he was going to do his duty. The army went in after the bird because where the standard went was, by definition, where the unit was. And the commander, looking down his line, was not seeing 5,000 men. He was reading roughly 60 poles, a bar chart of his entire army, and if one pole drifted or fell, he knew exactly which 80 men were in trouble. The fourth layer was sound, because eyes fail in dust and forests and night. Vegetius describes 3 instruments with 3 separate jobs. The tuba, a straight bronze trumpet over a meter long, sounded the direct commands of battle: the advance, the halt, the retreat. The cornu, the great curved horn wrapped nearly full circle around the player's body, roughly 3 meters of bronze tubing braced on a wooden crossbar, spoke specifically to the standards, signaling the signa themselves to move. And we know its shape and voice with unusual confidence because actual cornua were recovered from Pompeii. And the buccina marked the rhythms of camp life, the watches of the night, the signals surrounding the commander. 3 voices, 3 vocabularies, deliberately kept apart, so that a soldier hearing brass through the roar of a battle knew instantly which category of information was arriving, before he even decoded the call, the way you know a fire alarm from a doorbell without a moment's thought. The players themselves, the tubicines and cornicines, were rated as immunes, specialists excused from ordinary fatigues, because the army understood that its nervous system was worth paying for. Combine the layers and you get something remarkable, a command network with a total transmission time of seconds. Built without a single piece of technology more advanced than a sheet of hammered bronze. Now, does the system actually hold up under contact? Rome ran that experiment for us, 3 times over, in 3 very different ways. The first test is the nightmare scenario, total surprise, and it comes from Caesar's own pen. In 57 BCE, at the River Sabus in what is now Belgium, Caesar's legions were strung out and half of them were building the evening camp, armor off, tools in hand, when tens of thousands of Nervii warriors, with their allies the Atrebates and Viromandui, burst from the tree line at a run, crossed the river, and were on them in minutes. This is precisely the situation formation systems are supposed to be too slow for. Caesar writes that there was no time for men to find their proper cohorts, no time even to put on helmets or strip the covers from shields, and that soldiers simply formed up under the first standards they saw, fighting the whole battle in scrambled units next to strangers. On the Roman right, the situation got so desperate that Caesar himself snatched a shield from a soldier in the rear ranks, pushed to the front line, and began calling out his centurions by name, ordering the standards forward and the ranks open so men had room to use their swords, which is worth noticing. Even in the crisis, the commands ran through names, standards, and spacing, the vocabulary of the system. And here's the point: it worked. The address system degraded gracefully. Even attached to the wrong standard, every man still knew the grammar: form on the pole, face out, hold your file, and the scrambled line held long enough for the 2 legions guarding the baggage train to arrive, and for the 10th, which had already stormed the enemy camp across the river, to turn back and take the Nervii from behind. Caesar credits the soldiers' training and experience for making their own decisions without orders. The Nervii, by his account, were nearly annihilated as a fighting people. He claims that of 60,000 men able to bear arms, barely 500 remained. The system survived its own failure, which is the highest compliment you can pay a system. The second test is the opposite, precision under pressure, at Pharsalus in Greece in 48 BCE. Caesar, by his own count, outnumbered roughly 2-to-1 by Pompey, around 22,000 legionaries against some 45,000, plus 7,000 cavalry against his 1,000, did something that sounds simple in a sentence and is fiendishly hard on a field. Mid-deployment, he quietly pulled 6 cohorts, roughly 3,000 men, out of his third line and tucked them behind his right flank as a hidden fourth line, angled to ambush Pompey's cavalry. Understand what that maneuver requires. 6 specific cohorts, out of 30 on the field, had to be extracted by address, walked through their own army, and reformed in a new position, without the other 24 cohorts drifting into the gaps, and without 7,000 enemy cavalry noticing. It happened because a cohort was a findable, callable object, 6 standards that could be told, and could tell their men exactly where to be. When Pompey's cavalry, commanded by Titus Labienus, Caesar's own former lieutenant, charged and shattered Caesar's thin screen of horsemen, the hidden fourth line stood up and did something the later sources say Caesar had specifically ordered. Instead of throwing their javelins, they held them and thrust upward at the riders' faces, on the theory that young aristocratic cavalrymen would flinch to protect their looks. Whatever the truth of that detail, the cavalry wing broke, the fourth line rolled up Pompey's exposed flank, and the battle, and arguably the Roman Republic, went with it. Caesar pauses in his own account to honor a single man, Crastinus, a retired first spear centurion of the 10th, who led the first charge, shouting that Caesar would thank him, living or dead, and who died with a sword through his mouth. Even Caesar's casualty list is an address book. That is what the marking system looks like when it is used as a scalpel. The third test has no enemy in it at all, and it might be the most revealing. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BCE, a Greek statesman held as a hostage in Rome, who set out to explain to his countrymen how they had been conquered, describes the Roman marching camp in the 6th book of his Histories, and the detail that stunned him was not the ramparts, it was the repetition. Every Roman camp was laid out to the same plan, the same streets, the same gates, the same unit plots and the same relative positions, every single night, no matter where in the world the army stopped. Surveyors rode ahead of the column, chose the ground, planted a flag where the general's tent would stand, and measured the whole city outward from that one point, with sighting instruments and colored markers, so that when the column arrived, every unit marched to a plot that already had its name on it. A legionary could arrive at a camp built that very afternoon in country he had never seen, and walk to his own tent in the dark, because his tent was always in the same place in the pattern. Polybius says the army settling into camp looked like a city's inhabitants returning each to their own home. He describes, too, the nightly circulation of the watchword on a small wooden tablet, the tessera, passed from the general down through every maniple and back again, with each handler accountable by name if it failed to return. Information moving through the same addresses as the men. Now connect that to Watling Street. Deployment from column into battle line was not a special event the Legion attempted on the day. It was the same addressing system the men rehearsed every evening of their marching lives, pitching the same city 10,000 times. Josephus, a Judean general who fought the Roman army, lost, was captured, and then watched it destroy his own country in the Jewish War of the 60s and 70s CE, wrote the most famous summary of it. Their drills were bloodless battles, and their battles were bloody drills. 5,000 men found their places in minutes at Watling Street because they had, in a very real sense, done it the night before, and every night before that. Which brings us to the failure point and the loop I opened at the start, the metal birds. The system's strength was that no single man mattered to it. Its weakness was that the markers mattered enormously. Every layer of the network, the paint, the poles, the horns, assumed one thing, that the army had room to unfold into its addresses. Deny it that room, and the finest sorting system in the ancient world was just a crowd carrying labeled luggage. In September of the year 9 CE, in the Teutoburg forest in Germany, the general Publius Quinctilius Varus led 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, plus auxiliaries and a long tail of civilians, strung out in a marching column miles long, through dense woodland, in driving rain, trusting a Germanic auxiliary commander named Arminius, who had already betrayed him. Arminius is the detail that makes the disaster a systems failure rather than bad luck, because he was not an outsider. He was a Cheruscan noble who had served in the Roman auxilia, held Roman citizenship and equestrian rank, and knew the address system from the inside, knew exactly what a legion could do on open ground, and exactly what it could not do as a snake in a forest. The ambush came against the column, not the line. Cassius Dio describes wind and rain lashing the trees, the ground turned to mud, the column intercut with its own wagons, and the army being eaten in segments over roughly 4 days. And since 1987, we have been able to walk the ground, because a British Army officer named Tony Clun, prospecting with a metal detector near the hill of Calcresa, north of Osnabrück, began turning up Roman silver denarii and lead sling bullets, and the excavations that followed found thousands of Roman military objects, a spectacular iron cavalry face mask, and the remains of a turf and sand wall the Germans had built along the hillside in advance, a prepared killing zone. Crucially, the coin series at Calcresa stops with Augustus, many pieces counter-stamped with the abbreviation of Varus's own name. The site is, in effect, date-stamped. Varus fell on his sword, 3 legions ceased to exist, and their numbers, 17, 18, 19, were never issued to any Roman legion again, out of an army list of 28. Rome deleted a tenth of its own order of battle rather than reuse the addresses. Suetonius records the Emperor Augustus beating his head against a door and crying out, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." And the 3 legionary eagles, the aquilae, were taken. Here is why that mattered beyond honor, and why I told you the eagle obsession is really an addressing story. The eagle was the legion's top-level marker, the root of the entire address, the one point around which a shattered formation could, in theory, always reform. A legion that lost its eagle had not just been humiliated, it had been deleted. Its rally point existed, but in an enemy's shrine. So Rome sent Germanicus back across the Rhine in 15 and 16 CE with 8 legions, at enormous cost. Tacitus describes the army reaching the old battlefield and finding bones heaped where the cohorts had made their stands, skulls nailed to trees, and the soldiers burying the remains of men whose units they could no longer even identify, the address system's ultimate horror, bodies without labels. Those campaigns recovered 2 of the 3 eagles, one taken back from the Bructeri, another the following year, and the sources indicate the third came home only in 41 CE, more than 3 decades after the battle, when troops under the Emperor Claudius retrieved it from the Chauci. Entire campaigns fought substantially to repatriate 3 bronze birds because those birds were not symbols bolted onto the machine. They were parts of the machine. Step back and look at what the Romans actually invented here, because it was not the sword and it was not the wall of shields. Plenty of ancient peoples had swords and shields, and many of them, man for man, may have been more fearsome than the average Italian farmer's son. What Rome built was an information system that ran on paint, silver, and brass, one that took the single hardest problem in pre-modern warfare, moving thousands of individual decisions into one coordinated shape faster than the enemy could interfere, and solved it so thoroughly that at Watling Street, 10-to-1 odds became, by the ancient accounts, 200-to-1 casualties in the other direction. And because the system lived in the equipment and the drill, rather than in any individual's head, it was portable and immortal in a way no warrior culture could match. A centurion transferred from Syria to Britain stepped into a camp with the same streets, standards with the same grammar, horns with the same vocabulary, and could command strangers on the first morning. Kill the men, and the system trained their replacements. The Britons on that plain brought courage, numbers, and momentum. The 14th Legion brought an address book. And when the day was over, the wagons that had been parked as grandstand seating had become the wall their owners died against. The next time you see a reconstruction of a Roman battle line, ignore the swords for a moment and look for the poles above the helmets, and the patterns on the shields, and remember that you are not looking at decoration. You are looking at the operating system, and it ran for close to 5 centuries. If this changed how you see the Roman army, subscribing to the channel is the best way to make sure the next campaign reaches you, and a like genuinely helps these longer histories find the people who want them. I will see you on the next field.